Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. After hitting the 500 episode mark, I need to tell you something that sounds completely wrong at first. Consistency is not the reason this worked. In fact, the original reason I started this podcast failed. It didn't just stumble, it failed completely. I did not build this show because I had some grand media strategy or a vision for a digital empire. I built it because I was out of work and needed a job, and I thought daily public output would function as undeniable proof of my value. It didn't work out that way, but that failure revealed something much more useful about how systems actually behave. So let me take one step back and explain the original design. Original design, the portfolio machine. At the beginning, this was not a brand play or a clever content strategy. It was not some polished creator vision where I had a 5-year plan, a monetization map, and a clean audience model ready to go. The reality was much simpler than that, and if I'm being honest, it was much more desperate. I was unemployed, and when you find yourself in that position, your thinking changes very quickly. You start asking a very specific question about how to make your value visible in a market that does not know you, does not trust you, and has no reason to believe you can create business impact. That was the actual problem I was trying to solve, so I designed what I thought was a rational answer, a daily podcast. The logic seemed sound at the time because I figured if I published every day, people would see that I was serious. I believed that by talking through technical topics in public, people would hear that I knew my field, and if I kept going long enough, hiring managers would assume discipline, depth, and reliability. If all of that was visible, I told myself the system would eventually convert. This wasn't content as art, it was content as employability infrastructure. The podcast was supposed to act like a public portfolio machine where every episode served as a signal or a visible asset. It was my way of saying that I could think, explain, and show up while staying consistent under pressure. From a system perspective, that belief was built on 4 specific assumptions that I now see were quite fragile. First, I assumed that consistency would be interpreted as competence. Second, I thought volume would signal seriousness to the market. Third, I believed public proof would reduce the perceived risk of hiring me. Finally, I assumed the people consuming the content would either be decision makers or people who could influence them. Now, if you say all of that quickly, it sounds reasonable, and this is exactly why so many people fall into the same trap. The system feels productive because you are shipping, you are visible, and you are building an archive of work in public. You feel a sense of momentum, but here is the thing. Production and conversion are not the same thing. At that stage, I had built a production system rather than a distribution system, and that distinction changes everything. Because I was optimizing for output, I focused on daily episodes, topic coverage, and technical depth, but I was not really optimizing for reach or role relevance. I had a publishing engine, but I did not have a narrative engine, and I definitely did not have a hiring conversion engine. That matters because employers do not hire content volume. They hire for reduced risk inside a specific business context. They hire when they can map what you do to what they actually need. And my early system assumed this mapping would happen automatically. I thought if I just produced enough proof, the market would do the translation for me, but it simply would not. And why is that important? Because this is where a lot of technical people get stuck. We think evidence speaks for itself, and we believe if the work is good enough, the market will eventually notice. We think if we demonstrate enough expertise, opportunity will naturally follow, but business reality is harsher than that. Evidence without context is just noise to the wrong audience, effort without positioning is invisible, and consistency by itself is often just unrewarded labor. I remember how strong that belief was at the time, and I genuinely thought I was building the shortest path to trust one episode at a time. To be fair, the system did produce something, including discipline and a public record of my thoughts, so the machine was not entirely useless. It was just pointed at the wrong outcome. The original design expected the podcast to function like a job magnet, but what it actually became was a thinking machine and a relationship surface. It was a way to sharpen my language through repetition, but none of that was the original goal. The goal was employment, and that expected conversion never really came. So before we talk about what this process gave me, we need to be honest about where it failed first. Failure 1, content as a job portfolio. So let's make the first failure very plain. The podcast as a job portfolio did not work the way I thought it would. I put in all the necessary inputs from daily episodes and technical depth to a public archive, but the results didn't follow. I had created proof that I could think in structure, show up consistently, and explain complicated Microsoft topics in a way people could follow. On paper, that should have been useful, and in a very narrow sense, it was. But it did not create the outcome I built it for. It did not reliably generate interviews, it did not create a flow of job offers, and it definitely did not remove the uncertainty that exists inside hiring decisions. That is the part I think many people don't want to say out loud. Because if you invest that much effort into public work, you want to believe the market will reward it directly. You want to believe effort compounds into opportunity, and that if people can see the work, they will understand the value. But employers do not buy visible effort. Instead, they buy fit, timing, role alignment, and reduced risk. And those are not the same thing. From a systems perspective, the problem was not that the podcast lacked quality. The problem was that the signal was too open, too broad, and far too interpretive for a standard business process. A hiring manager does not sit there thinking that because this person has 200 or 500 episodes, they must be the right person for this exact business problem in this exact team at this exact moment. That is not how those systems work. Hiring systems are filters, not open-ended appreciation engines. They don't reward output in the abstract. They look for relevance. Can this person solve our problem? Can they operate in our environment? Can they speak our language? Can they reduce the cost of making the wrong hire? That last one matters more than most people think, because hiring is rarely about finding the most interesting person. It is usually about reducing downside. So if your content proves that you are smart, disciplined, and technically capable, that helps a little. But if it does not also make your business value easy to map, then the content stays informative without becoming decisive. And that is exactly what happened. The podcast created visibility, but visibility is not the same as decision confidence. People could see me and hear me, and they could probably tell that I knew what I was talking about, but that still left a massive gap. What problem do I solve inside an organization? Where do I fit in a leadership structure? How do I influence delivery, adoption, governance, architecture, or business outcomes? That translation layer was weak, and if the translation layer is weak, the portfolio stays trapped at the level of activity. This is the trap. A lot of technical people assume that public proof automatically becomes professional leverage, but it doesn't. Public proof only works when the audience can attach it to a business narrative. Without that, your content may build respect, awareness, or even admiration. But admiration does not sign contracts, it does not open headcount, and it does not force a recruiter to move you to the next stage. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. A lot of the people who consume technical content are not hiring decision makers anyway. They are peers, learners, and practitioners who are interested but are not in a position to convert that interest into employment. So the system was producing attention in places that did not naturally lead to the result I wanted. Again, the system was doing exactly what it was built to do. It created output, public proof, and technical credibility, but it just was not built with a strong conversion path to employment. That is the difference. And once you see that, the emotional part becomes easier to understand too, because then you stop asking why this didn't work, as if the market somehow ignored something obvious, and you start asking the better question. What outcome was this system actually optimized for? The reason is I had confused proof of work with proof of fit, and those are very different assets. Proof of work says, I can do things, while proof of fit says, I can do the specific things that matter here, in this role, for this organization, under these constraints. My podcast gave the first signal, but the market was buying the second. Once you understand that gap, the next false promise becomes obvious. Why visibility didn't convert. So let's go one level deeper, because this is where the real misunderstanding sits. The podcast created visibility, and that part is true. People could find me, they could listen, and they could see that I had put in the work. But awareness is not the same thing as relevance, and relevance is not the same thing as commercial confidence. That is the gap, and most people never really audit that gap. They just keep publishing and hope the market will eventually reward the effort, but hope is not a strategy. From a system perspective, visibility failed to convert because the content answered the wrong question. It answered, do I know something? It did not answer clearly enough. What changes for a business if I am inside the room? That difference matters a lot because organizations are not buying information. They are buying risk reduction, speed, clarity, and better decisions. And if your content proves technical depth without connecting that depth to business outcomes, then people may respect you, but they still won't know where to place you. You become interesting, not necessary, and interesting is a weak commercial position. I think this is where many technical creators get trapped. We assume the market will do the final translation. We explain the feature, the update, and the architecture, and we think the audience will automatically infer the impact on adoption, governance, cost, execution, or leadership. But most people don't do that extra work, especially not inside hiring systems or busy organizations when they are trying to fill a role quickly. They need narrative compression. They need to understand fast why you matter. And in my case, that compression was missing for too long. There was a lot of technical proof, but not enough business framing. There was a lot of knowledge, but not enough context around organizational value. There was a lot of explanation, but not enough positioning. So the content showed that I was active, it showed discipline, and it showed endurance. But activity is not a role, effort is not a use case, and endurance is not by itself a commercial argument. Now map that to how hiring systems actually work today. Most of them are built around filters like role titles, keywords, industry language, problem framing, budget ownership, and decision scope. And that means your public work has to be legible inside those filters, not just impressive outside them. If a hiring manager is looking for someone who can improve decision flow, reduce governance chaos, or connect Microsoft 365 architecture to measurable business outcomes, they need to hear that language from you directly. They shouldn't have to guess it from your consistency. And that was the issue. The podcast often lived at the level of technical credibility, but hiring and commercial systems often often evaluate business utility. Those are connected, but they are not identical. And this is where another uncomfortable truth shows up. A content audience is not automatically a buyer audience. A listener may trust your thinking, a peer may appreciate your depth, and a practitioner may learn from your episodes, but none of that guarantees access to a hiring budget, a project budget, or a leadership conversation. The attention can be real and still have low conversion value. That's important because otherwise we romanticize audience growth as if every view carries the same weight. It doesn't. 10,000 passive listeners are not the same as 10 operators who control strategy, spend, or execution. This changes everything, because once you stop measuring attention as one flat thing, you start seeing why visibility alone was insufficient. I did not have a distribution problem only. I had a contextual relevance problem. The people who found the work were often not the people who could act on the work in the way I originally wanted. And even when the right people were nearby, the content still needed stronger translation into business reality. So the failure was not that visibility had no value. It did. The failure was expecting visibility to do the work of positioning. It can't. Visibility gets you seen, but positioning tells people what to do with what they see. And if that second layer is weak, awareness just floats. It creates motion without direction, which brings me to the path I did not take. Failure 2, the certification trap. Now from there, the obvious next move would have been certifications. To be clear, I'm not against certifications because they can be useful for creating structure and helping people enter a field to build their confidence. This is not one of those lazy takes where I pretend credentials have no value, but in my situation, doubling down on them would have looked rational on the surface while remaining fragile underneath. Because what problem would that actually have solved? If the podcast had already shown that I was serious, that I could learn, and that I could explain technical topics in public, then another certificate would not have fixed the deeper issue. It would have added more evidence of knowledge. Yet the market was not rejecting me because it lacked proof that I could pass an exam. The market was failing to convert because the business relevance of my work was not framed clearly enough, and different problems require different interventions. From a systems perspective, another certification would have increased inventory rather than leverage. That distinction matters because inventory is just more of the same asset, whereas leverage is the thing that changes the outcome of multiple assets at once. A certification can tell people you understand a platform, but it does not automatically tell them you can create movement inside an organization or show how you think through ambiguity. It does not prove that you can map tools to outcomes, and it definitely does not guarantee better communication with decision makers. So yes, I could have stacked more credentials, and many people would have advised exactly that to become more official and validated by the platform. But I had started to notice something uncomfortable about very credentialed people who still struggled to position their value. They knew the tools and the configuration paths, but when it came time to explain why any of it mattered for the business, the message got weak very quickly. And why is that? Because credentials prove memorized structure rather than translation or judgment. They do not prove that you can stand between technology and leadership to make the connection usable, which is a skill that business reality rewards far more than most technical people expect. I remember being close to that decision point and wondering if I should keep collecting external proof or improve the thing that kept getting exposed every time proof failed to convert. That was the real fork in the road, because if I had chosen the certification path harder, I think I would have felt productive and busy, but it would have been structural compensation, using a familiar technical mechanism to avoid a harder strategic truth. The truth was not that I lacked more information, but that I needed better articulation and message control to become easier to understand in terms of business value. Once you see the gap clearly, the credential path starts to look like a local optimization that is useful in a narrow layer but weak in the layer that actually determines outcomes. That's why I didn't double down on it, not because credentials are bad, but because they weren't the bottleneck or the constraint inside the system. If you optimize the wrong constraint, you can work very hard while staying structurally stuck, which is how a lot of careers work today. People add more proof to the wrong layer by chasing more courses and badges, yet none of it moves the actual conversion point. Because the issue isn't knowledge, it's market legibility, and whether people can quickly understand what changes when you are involved. That is the business test. And once I stopped pretending another certification would solve that, I had to choose a different kind of skill entirely. Rejecting one path only matters if you choose another. The skill shift that changed the system. So I made a different bet, not on another certification or more technical inventory, but on script writing. At first, that probably sounds smaller than it is, because when people hear writing, they often think about style or content polish. But that was not the shift, and the real change was actually forced structure. When you write for spoken delivery, weak thinking gets exposed very fast. You can hide bad logic in slides or vague ideas in jargon, and you can certainly hide confusion in long documents that sound important. You cannot hide it very long in a spoken script, because the moment a sentence becomes hard to say, there is usually a deeper problem with the thought or the sequence. Writing scripts changed the system because it forced a different standard of thinking where I had to ask what the actual point was and why it mattered to the listener. That discipline is different from technical knowledge because it is architectural, meaning you are not just collecting facts but designing comprehension. That changed me more than I expected, and once you start doing that repeatedly, your thinking becomes more ordered. You stop dumping information and start building arguments, selecting only what moves the listener toward clarity, rather than explaining everything you know. That is a business skill, and maybe one of the most underrated ones, because value is often lost in translation long before it is lost in execution. A good idea explained badly will usually lose to a simpler idea explained clearly, not because it is weaker, but because it is easier to act on. This writing shift improved three things at the same time, starting with my thinking, as I had to sequence ideas with intent and stop confusing complexity with depth. Second, it improved my communication because if a point could not survive spoken delivery, it was not ready, which meant less fluff and less hiding behind terms that sound smart but don't help anyone decide. Third, it improved my positioning because once you learn to write clearly, you also learn to frame clearly. Framing is where technology starts becoming business reality and you stop saying, here is the feature, and start saying, here is the organizational consequence. You stop describing tools in isolation and start mapping them to risk, speed, governance, and decision quality. That shift is huge because now the value is not locked inside technical explanation and it becomes usable for leaders and people responsible for outcomes. This is where the system began to produce a different kind of return that was more durable than a direct job conversion. Script writing started acting like a force multiplier across everything else, making the podcast better because the arguments became tighter and the live streams better because the message had structure. Partnerships and events improved because communication is coordination and coordination is execution. Even strategy conversations changed because when you can translate complexity into a decision path, people experience you differently. You are no longer just the technical person who knows things, but the person who helps make things legible, which is a high-value role in any business. I remember noticing that this skill was compounding in places where certifications never could. Not because writing replaced technical depth, but because it gave that depth a delivery mechanism. Once that bridge exists, the whole asset stack changes and your knowledge becomes easier to trust and repeat. Your value becomes easier to position, and this was the real pivot away from technical expression without business framing. That is what changed the system, and this is where the consistency myth starts to break. Failure 3, the pure consistency model. This brings us to the third failure, and it is probably the most uncomfortable one to discuss because it attacks a belief the internet repeats like a religion. You've heard the commandments before: just stay consistent, keep showing up, publish every day, and do the reps until the market finally responds. Now, to be fair, consistency does matter because without it, most systems never survive long enough to teach you anything valuable about your audience or your product. But here's the problem: consistency is not the same thing as leverage, and confusing the two wasted a massive amount of my energy. For a long time, I believed that output would compound automatically, and that authority would emerge as a natural side effect of simply staying in the game. I convinced myself that the archive itself would start pulling opportunities toward me, and that sheer frequency would eventually turn into real market traction. Sometimes it actually looked like that was happening, which is the most dangerous part of this entire mindset. There is a phase in these systems where the activity feels so productive that you stop questioning whether it is actually effective for your business. You have momentum, you have a solid routine, and you have proof that you are disciplined enough to outwork the competition. Because most people struggle to stay consistent at all, you start to view your daily output as a primary competitive advantage. But an activity advantage is not always a market advantage, and often it is just a very efficient way to stay busy without moving the needle. That was the trap I fell into. I had built a machine that was excellent at producing, but I had not yet built a machine that could direct that production toward a specific business outcome. When that link is weak, consistency becomes a form of structural compensation where you keep moving because movement feels safer than actual strategy. You keep publishing because those numbers are measurable, telling yourself that the next 100 pieces of content will unlock something the first few hundred did not. If the architecture underneath the work is weak, more output just scales that weakness across a larger surface area. That is the part people don't like to hear because consistency has a moral quality in our online culture that makes it feel beyond reproach. It sounds disciplined and admirable, like the kind of honest hard work that should be rewarded by default. However, markets do not reward effort just because it is admirable. They reward effort when it reduces friction, solves a specific problem, and reaches the right people in the right frame. That is a completely different standard than just showing up. So while I became very consistent, that volume alone did not create any meaningful lift or automatically improve my distribution. It created a massive archive. And while an archive has value for long-tail discovery, it is not a substitute for leverage. Leverage is what changes the outcome per unit of effort. And once I started looking at my work through that business lens, the consistency myth began to crack. I could finally see the mismatch between my high input and my low conversion rates. I had a strong routine but weak compounding, which meant I was putting in a lot of effort without enough directional force to change my reality. Consistency fills the pipe, but it does not decide where that pipe actually leads. It keeps the engine running without defining whether that engine is connected to demand, to decision makers, or to an actual growth mechanism. This is exactly why so many digital initiatives disappoint the people funding them. The teams are active and the dashboards are moving, but the system was optimized for motion rather than consequence. I had to admit to myself that daily publishing was not proof the model was working. It was only proof that I could sustain the model. One of those measures endurance, while the other measures system design. And in a business context, endurance without design is just a slow path to burnout. Consistency is a lie when people present it as the only thing that creates outcomes because it still needs distribution, positioning, and narrative fit to succeed. Without those layers, you are just repeating effort inside an under-optimized system that isn't built to scale. So the question eventually changed for me. I stopped asking if I could keep going and started asking what inside this whole machine was actually creating movement. Output versus leverage. So let's answer that directly. What actually creates movement? This is the point where a lot of people keep doing more of the same when what they really need is a completely different architecture for their work. There is a massive structural difference between producing content and building leverage, even though they often look the same from the outside. Producing content creates assets like episodes, posts, and videos that live in an archive. That archive is certainly useful for sharpening your thinking and proving you are a serious professional, but leverage is something else entirely. Leverage means that the same unit of effort starts producing more downstream effect, whether that is more reach, more trust, or a higher density of opportunities. I treated output like it was automatically leveraged for a long time, assuming the archive would eventually become a self-sustaining growth engine. But an archive is passive unless it is connected to a distribution infrastructure that carries value to the people who can actually act on it. Distribution is not just posting to a platform and hoping the algorithm is in a good mood. It is a mechanism built on owned channels and audience habits. This mistake happens constantly inside large companies where teams optimize for output instead of outcomes. They build more dashboards, more apps, and more documents, and everyone feels productive because the volume of work is visible to the leadership. But if none of that changes decision speed or customer value, then the system is producing activity rather than leverage. It isn't a motivational problem for the employees, it is a design problem at the structural level. Output is simply easier to count than influence because it is local and you can control the schedule and the measurements immediately. Leverage is slower and more structural, often sitting 1 or 2 layers downstream from the initial action, so people default to the thing that feels manageable. They produce more and talk more, but if the packaging and audience mapping are weak, they are just filling a warehouse that nobody ever visits. When you work hard, you want that work to mean something on its own, but the market is not grading you on your discipline or your effort. The market is responding to transfer. Can your value travel? Can it reach the right people? And can they understand it quickly enough to repeat it to someone else? That is what real leverage looks like. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped viewing an episode as the product and started seeing it as one node in a larger system. The content needs a relationship layer around it and a clear path into trust. Otherwise, those assets stay isolated and fail to compound. This is why some people can publish less frequently and still create a much larger impact than those posting every single day. Their system carries the value further through better packaging and stronger network effects, meaning their output does not die the moment it is published. More activity does not mean more impact. And in many cases, high activity is just what people use when they haven't solved the leverage question yet. Once you understand that, you stop admiring volume for its own sake and you start asking better questions about where your work actually travels. You begin to look for the doors it opens and the system behaviors it changes, because that is the only lens that matters for long-term growth. When I applied that lens honestly to my own work, I finally realized that the real growth engine was not the podcast alone. What actually worked? 1. Distribution leverage. The real growth engine behind everything wasn't the podcast alone, it was distribution. I need to say that very clearly because this is where the whole story changes, and for a long time I mistakenly thought the hard part was just production. I kept asking myself if I could stay disciplined enough to keep publishing and if I could make enough things for the market to actually notice me. But production was only the visible part of the machine, while the invisible part that actually changed my outcomes was audience access. That access came much more through the M365 show, through live streams, LinkedIn, and the newsletter than it ever did through the podcast by itself. This isn't a criticism of the podcast, it's a systems observation, because the podcast helped build my capability while distribution helped create the consequence. And the measurable signal here really matters. matters. We are talking about more than 100,000 followers and around 30,000 newsletter subscribers. Now, those numbers are not there to impress anyone. They matter because they represent reachable attention rather than abstract potential or algorithmic hope. Reachable attention means that when something matters, there is a clear path for it to travel, whether that is a new idea, a new event, a collaboration, or a new offer. That changes the economics of effort because once distribution exists, one single piece of thinking can move across multiple surfaces like LinkedIn, the newsletter, and partner conversations. And why is that so important? It's because owned channels behave very differently from borrowed visibility, which is inherently fragile and unreliable. You post something and maybe the platform shows it, or maybe it doesn't, but there is no real continuity or structural resilience in that model. Owned reach is different because a newsletter subscriber is a repeat access path and a live stream audience is a recurring proximity layer that changes trust. This doesn't happen because people become emotionally attached in some vague creator economy way, but because repeated exposure reduces the cost of interpretation. People start to understand how you think, they know what you focus on, and they learn your language until they can place you accurately in their own mental model. That is a business asset. This is also why I say distribution beats production when outcomes matter, because production fills the pipe, but distribution decides whether value actually travels through it. Without distribution, even the best work can stay structurally trapped, but with it, the same work starts building feedback loops that improve the whole system. You hear what resonates, you see where people lean in, and you notice what creates real demand, which makes your positioning clearer and your content sharper. This is not about becoming an influencer, a label I don't actually care about. It's about building audience infrastructure that can carry useful ideas into real business environments. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped treating the podcast as the center of gravity and started seeing it as one part of a wider system where distribution did the compounding. That changed how I evaluated my progress. So instead of asking if I published today, I asked if I reached the right people and if I made the next move easier. That is the real test. A lot of professionals still underestimate what they are building because they think an audience is just a vanity metric. But when that audience is reachable and the channels are owned, it becomes an asset. Why distribution beats consistency. So why does distribution beat consistency? It's because consistency is internal while distribution is relational, meaning consistency says you can keep producing while distribution says the value can keep moving. That difference is everything. If you publish every day but the work never reaches the right people in the right context, then all you have built is a private discipline ritual with public storage. Distribution changes that because it alters the feedback loop around the work. So the content isn't just leaving you, it's returning signals about who is paying attention. You see who shares it, who replies, and who starts mapping your thinking to a real business problem, which is the part that actually matters for growth. Opportunities are rarely created by one piece of content in isolation. They are created by repeated contact across trusted channels like a weekly newsletter or a recurring live stream. This is not just audience growth, it is relationship design. And relationship design compounds differently than linear output. You don't just make one thing after another, you create non-linear effects where one idea can travel further and create several downstream conversations from one original thought. That is a very different economic model, and once you see it, you notice how many people confuse the act of publishing with actual market penetration. Existence is not distribution and publication is not proximity, because awareness without repeated access usually fades away very fast. That is why owned channels matter so much, since a newsletter is permissioned attention that reduces your dependency on platform volatility and gives you a direct path into someone's working week. The same applies to live streams because they create a recurring presence, and trust compounds through repeated exposure to coherent thinking rather than one-off discovery. Now map that to business reality. If you are trying to create partnerships or market awareness, consistency only helps if there is already a path for your value to circulate. If that path is weak, more consistency just feeds a weak channel, which is why so many organizations misread their own digital initiatives and wonder why the effect stays thin. The reason is that the system was optimized to generate output, not to carry outcomes through the organization, leaving it with no distribution logic or reinforcement loop. From a system perspective, that is fragile because borrowed reach can disappear overnight when algorithms change or platform incentives shift. Owned distribution is more resilient because it creates repeat pathways back to the people who already understand your frame and your way of working. This is also where community starts to matter in a structural sense, because when people return repeatedly and interact across formats, the system becomes connection first rather than content first. That changes the business value completely because you are no longer just broadcasting, you are hosting an environment that creates faster feedback and higher trust density. Environments create different outcomes than archives, offering more chances for the right people to meet each other around the work you are doing. So yes, consistency helped me stay in motion, but distribution created the compounding layer and a much more resilient path from thinking to opportunity. What actually worked? 2. Event execution. And then the system got tested in the place where content alone cannot hide, which was the world of live execution. Because content lets you describe reality, but events force you to coordinate it, and that creates a very different kind of pressure. When M365con.net started becoming real, something changed in how people perceived the work, not because there was suddenly more opinion, but because there was more orchestration. And orchestration is visible in a different way. You cannot fake an event with thousands of attendees, and you certainly cannot bluff your way through speaker coordination, scheduling, and promotion at that scale. The market sees very quickly whether you can actually carry complexity, and that is why this mattered so much for the business. At the event level, the signal was clear with around 5,400 attendees and 70 speakers joining the platform. Now, again, those numbers are not there for ego, but they matter because they show something content by itself cannot show very well. They represent operational capacity, trust density, and execution under pressure. An event is a live systems test. It reveals whether your audience is passive or mobilizable, and it shows whether your network is shallow or truly committed to the outcome. It reveals whether your communication is good enough to coordinate real people around a shared goal, and that changes authority very fast. Because once you move from commenting on an ecosystem to organizing one, people update their model of who you are. You are no longer just the person with ideas, but the person who can make moving parts align, and that is a different category of credibility. And why is that? Because execution reduces speculation. A lot of content lives in hypothetical territory where people talk about what should happen or what companies should do. That has value, but theory always leaves room for doubt, whereas execution closes that gap entirely. It says, this did happen, people showed up, and the system carried real load. That is a much stronger signal than opinion alone. I noticed this shift very clearly as the project moved forward. Before, the podcast proved I could think, but the event proved I could coordinate. Before, I could explain ecosystems, but now I was helping build one. And that difference matters in business reality because organizations trust people who can carry consequence. It is easy to underestimate how much authority changes when you move from publishing into orchestration. But here's what actually happens. The event forces better standards everywhere. Messaging has to get sharper because confusion scales, and processes have to get clearer because handoffs multiply. Partnerships have to become more concrete because dependency becomes real, which means time, sequence, and responsibility matter more. In other words, the whole system has to grow up. And that is why event execution became such a powerful part of the overall story. It created a new kind of proof that I could help create an environment where other people could succeed too. That is an executive signal. Because leaders are not measured by how much they personally know, but by whether they can create conditions where coordinated outcomes become possible. That is what events train. And once you have done that, your voice changes a little and your judgment changes too. Because now you are not just asking if an idea is interesting, but if it can actually hold when multiple people and expectations collide. That is a much better business question. This is also why I say execution creates authority faster than content. Content can open the door, but execution changes the room. It creates evidence that you can operate, not just analyze. And in markets full of people explaining what should happen, the people who can carry complexity into a real outcome stand out very quickly. So for me, M365con.net was not just another project, but a structural shift. It was a move from media as proof of knowledge toward execution as proof of capacity. And once that happened, the podcast itself started looking different. Not smaller, but more grounded, because now the ideas were connected to something that had survived contact with reality. Why events rewire authority? So why do events rewire authority so fast? Because they expose something content can protect you from, which is operational truth. When you publish an episode, you control the frame and the pacing, and you choose what gets included and what stays out. Even when you are being honest, the format still protects you a little. An event does not. An event reveals whether trust is portable. Can speakers trust you with their time? And can attendees trust you with their attention? Can the whole thing hold together when many people depend on the same outcome at the same time? That is the real test. And why is that important? Because business authority is rarely built on ideas alone. It is built on carried consequence. People start trusting you differently when they see that you can move from concept to coordination and from theory to an environment that actually works. This is where events become very different from content output. They are not just communication assets, but orchestration assets, and orchestration is one of the clearest signals of executive capability. Think about what an event actually requires, from speaker management and audience communication to scheduling, logic, and technical delivery. None of that is glamorous, but all of it is visible in the outcome. If one part fails badly, the whole thing feels unstable. So when an event works, what people are really seeing is not a nice brand moment, but coordinated reliability across many moving parts. That changes perception quickly. Because from a system perspective, events compress trust. Normally, people would need multiple projects and many meetings to understand whether you can handle complexity. An event accelerates that judgment by giving the market a live demonstration of how you operate. That is why I say events rewire authority. They shift you from commentator to carrier, and carriers are rare. A lot of people can explain a market, but far fewer can convene one. Far fewer can create enough confidence that dozens of speakers say yes and the thing survives contact with reality. That is not a soft signal, it is operational proof. And this creates a deeper business implication. Execution changes how people estimate your future capacity. Before an event, someone might think you have interesting ideas, but after an event, they start thinking you can probably run more things than they assumed. That is a huge shift because markets often make decisions based on inferred capacity. Can this person handle complexity, carry risk, and align people in bigger rooms? Events answer those questions much faster than content usually can. This is also why execution often beats expertise in shaping perception. Not because expertise does not matter, but because expertise without delivery stays theoretical. Execution proves that the expertise can survive constraint, time pressure, and reputation pressure. And once people see that, they stop hearing your ideas as isolated opinions. They hear them as informed by operational contact, and that is a different authority layer. Now map that to leadership more broadly. Inside companies, the people who rise are rarely the ones with the most isolated knowledge. They are the ones who reduce coordination costs. They make handoffs clearer, risk more manageable, and complexity easier to carry. That is exactly what event execution trains. So the return from an event is never just attendance. Attendance is the visible metric, but the deeper return is credibility under load. And once you have that, your content changes too. Not because you become louder, but because you become more believable. The ideas carry more weight because people have seen the system behind them operate in public. And the most important return still was not attendance. What actually worked? 3. Network density. And this is where the story becomes even more important for how we understand growth. Because if you look closely at the last few years, the biggest return on this entire investment wasn't the download count or the views. It wasn't even the attendance at our live events, but rather it was the direct access to a specific group of people. I'm talking about the builders who were testing things, failing in public, and feeding those hard-won lessons back into the wider ecosystem. That changed everything for me because network density is not just a soft benefit or a nice social extra. It functions as an acceleration layer that fundamentally changes how fast you can learn and how quickly you see around corners. For a long time, I think I underestimated that reality because I saw audience as scale and content as proof. While those things are true, the highest value asset sitting underneath the whole structure was proximity to operators and experts. These were the people actually carrying responsibility inside complex projects, communities, and collaborations. And why is that so powerful for a business? Because while a passive audience size can make you visible, network density is what makes you adaptive. If you know a lot of people loosely, you might have reach, but if you know the right people well enough to exchange trust and context, you have a system that can move. I started to see this play out through our various collaborations, academy work, and live streams. Conversations that began casually often turned into partnerships, invitations, and entirely new formats that I couldn't have invented alone. None of that came from broadcasting into a void, but instead it came from repeated interaction with people who were also building. Builders talk differently to each other because they skip the performance layer and get straight to the constraints. They want to know what is working, what is failing, and where the actual bottlenecks are hiding. That kind of exchange is incredibly valuable, not just because it feels good socially, but because it shortens the distance between observation and correction. You make better decisions when you are close to real operators, and you waste much less time on theories that sound good but break under pressure. In a market that changes as quickly as ours, getting a signal early is a major competitive advantage. And this is also why I think many people overestimate their audience size while completely underestimating their trust density. A large passive audience can provide social proof and awareness, but awareness is a weak asset if it isn't connected to people who will actually build with you. Network density wins because it creates optionality rather than just vanity. Once you are inside a trusted network, new paths appear faster, and while they aren't guaranteed outcomes, they are lower friction paths into collaboration and execution. This is a very different operating model from trying to force everything through solo output. From a systems perspective, this creates structural resilience because if one project slows down, the network still carries the motion. If one format loses energy, the relationships you've built will naturally create new channels for growth. If one part of the business becomes uncertain, trusted people can help create other paths forward, which is the definition of redundancy. Redundancy matters when you are building in public and trying to turn ideas into real business infrastructure. When I look back at what actually worked, I cannot honestly say the biggest return was the content performance. The real return was that the work kept putting me in proximity to people I would not have reached otherwise. These were people who were further ahead in certain areas, people who opened doors, and people who challenged my deepest assumptions. That is where the compounding really came from, not from the archive itself, but from the human graph forming around it. Relationships aren't just a side effect of the work, they are the core infrastructure. If content builds awareness and events build authority, then network density is what builds true capability. It gives the whole system more intelligence and more paths forward than any solo archive ever could. The people inside the system, Now we get to the part that matters most, which is the part people in tech still tend to undermodel in their spreadsheets. And I'm talking about the people inside the system. Once you understand network density, the next question is obvious. Who actually made the system stronger? Who increased the resilience of the project and prevented it from becoming another fragile solo endeavor? This is where the story stops being about content and starts becoming about human infrastructure. Human infrastructure matters because no serious system scales on output alone. It scales on trusted nodes. These are the people who bring capability, correction, and momentum when one part of the structure starts to weaken. For me, one of those people is Marcel Broschke, and I say that very deliberately. When people look at a visible project, they usually only see the front layer, like the episode or the announcement. They do not always see the builder energy behind the scenes that turns a scattered opportunity into actual movement. Marcel brought that energy, and it wasn't just about effort or enthusiasm, but the ability to connect governance and execution. Good collaborators do not just add output, they increase the total system capacity. They make larger moves possible than you could have ever carried on your own, which makes their contribution structural rather than just helpful. Then there is Marcel Lehmann, whose role sits in a different but equally important place in the system. There are moments in any long cycle of work where your internal confidence is actually lower than your external activity suggests. You keep shipping and you keep building, but internally the model still feels uncertain. In those moments, belief from the right person matters more than most professionals want to admit. It isn't about needing an emotional rescue, but rather about how borrowed confidence can stabilize execution long enough for reality to catch up. That is a system outcome too, and Marcel Lehmann brought that kind of energy at moments where my self-trust wasn't operating at full strength. If you have ever built something for a long time without immediate validation, you know exactly how important that is. Sometimes people do not just support your work, they support your ability to continue interpreting your own work correctly. That prevents distortion and keeps you from making a premature retreat when things get difficult. Then there is the wider circle, including people like 42 NATO and others who have been around the work over time. They aren't always in the center or visible in a headline, but they are present and responsive. Resilient human systems are not built from one heroic relationship, but are instead built from redundancy and multiple trusted points of support. We use this same logic in architecture because if too much load sits on one node, you create a single point of failure. Unfortunately, a lot of careers are built exactly like that, with too much identity in one employer or too much confidence in one income source. That is not strength, it is concentration risk. One of the biggest lessons in all of this is that trusted people are not a nice extra around the work, but are actually part of the work itself. They are the infrastructure that allows the work to survive, adapt, and eventually expand into new areas. Once you see that, you stop talking about relationships like they are separate from business reality. They are business reality because resilient careers are carried by trusted nodes that absorb instability before it becomes a total collapse. That is what I was really building, even before I had the right language to describe it. It wasn't just content or an audience, but a more redundant human system. And once you understand that, the entire podcast starts looking very different. The unexpected product of 500 episodes. Once you look at the data, honestly, the podcast starts changing shape in your mind. It isn't just about the archive or the list of guests anymore, because the meaning of the work shifts when the original design fails to hit the mark. If the plan was simply to build a public portfolio and get hired, then that specific part of the system didn't deliver the expected result. But the process kept producing something else entirely, something I didn't fully grasp when I hit record on episode 1. The podcast never actually became a job machine, but it evolved into a thinking machine, and that has become a far more durable asset for my business. Long-form audio does something specific to your brain when you show up week after week because it forces a level of endurance in your arguments that short-form content just can't match. You have to hold a line of thought long enough for it to become useful to someone else. You have to map out where an idea starts, what evidence supports it, what logic weakens it, and exactly where that thought needs to land to make sense. This isn't just content creation or building a brand, it's high-level judgment training that happens in real time. At the beginning of this journey, I mostly saw episodes as individual outputs or things I had made to prove I was active. I wanted to show the world I was learning and that I had the discipline to show up, but over time, the most important result wasn't what sat in the archive. The real value was what the process was doing to my own internal operating system, because it sharpened my ability to sequence ideas and synthesize complex information. When you have to speak clearly across hundreds of episodes, the system eventually punishes you for being confused. You start to hear your own weak points and notice exactly where your logic slips, feeling that friction when an idea is technically correct but structurally incomplete. That feedback is brutal when you're listening back to your own voice, but it's the only way to find where your thinking still leaks. The real product of 500 episodes wasn't a media library at all, but rather the mental compression that only happens through disciplined repetition. I wasn't just repeating the same words, I was practicing the discipline of taking complexity, reducing the distortion, and making the truth transferable to another person. This is where my identity started to shift from a technical explainer into something else. I started out focused on tools, updates, and implementation details, which are all still useful, but I realized the real value wasn't in the feature layer. The value was sitting in the translation, asking what a specific change actually does to a business or what new risks it creates for the organization. The podcast was no longer just training me to explain how technology works, it was training me to locate the consequence of that technology. Once you can do that consistently, people stop seeing you as just another technical voice and start hearing you as someone who can connect the layers. You begin to bridge the gap between a tool and a workflow, and then connect that workflow to a specific business outcome. From a systems perspective, this is the most important return on the entire project. The archive and the audience certainly matter, but the deepest asset is the person the process produced. I became someone with better endurance in thinking and sharper instincts for what matters in business reality versus what only sounds impressive in technical circles. Platforms, formats, and algorithms will always shift, but if a process turns you into a clearer thinker, then the output was never the only product. You were the product too, and I say that because some systems fail at their stated goal while building a much more durable capability underneath. The podcast didn't deliver the job I expected, but it delivered a stronger operator, which changes how you measure the success of the entire system. The shift from tech to business reality. This evolution in my own thinking meant the content itself had to change, because keeping the old center of gravity would have been a form of structural dishonesty. For years, the focus stayed on features and whatever Microsoft happened to release in Teams, SharePoint, or the Power Platform. I tracked what worked and what broke, and while technical detail always matters, the feature is rarely the actual business problem. A new feature is usually just the visible surface of a much deeper design question about whether an organization can actually absorb the change. We have to ask if the workflow improves, if decision quality goes up, or if accountability becomes more blurred when we flip a switch. This realization shifted my attention away from what a tool can do in theory toward what an organization can actually carry in practice. The business reality of technology isn't defined by a shiny product page, but by operating friction, adoption behavior, and management attention. These are the messy human variables that technical people often want to skip because they are harder to put into a diagram. However, those are the exact factors that determine whether a new system creates value or just stalls out. The channel started moving away from feature gravity and toward consequence gravity to provide better translation for the people doing the work. Most companies aren't suffering from a lack of features. They are suffering from a lack of integration between their tools and their operating logic. They already own more capability than they can absorb and more licenses than they can explain to their board. Adding another layer of technical explanation without business framing just creates more informational load for leaders who are already overwhelmed. What these people actually need is consequence mapping to understand what happens to their risk profile if they automate a bad process. If you roll AI into an unclear workflow, the value will disappear, and that is a business failure, not a technical one. Once I started taking those structural questions seriously, the audience widened to include architects, consultants, and founders. These are the people responsible for making sure an implementation survives its first contact with the actual organization. I wasn't abandoning the technical depth, but I was repositioning it inside the layer where it actually creates a business consequence. Technical depth without context creates specialists who can only explain parts, but technical depth inside a business context creates translation that people can actually use. My own language changed to focus less on roadmap theater and more on operational reality, looking at how a tool rewires decision flow and governance. The market is currently full of technology messaging that confuses a possibility with actual readiness. Just because a platform like Copilot can summarize data doesn't mean the surrounding system is ready for that behavior to take place. Just because the Power Platform allows you to move fast doesn't mean your company can govern the speed you've just created. Business reality lives in absorbability, not just capability. Once you anchor your thinking there, the channel becomes more valuable to people who aren't asking where to click, but are asking what they are building and what it will cost if the design is wrong. We moved from tech as information to tech as operating leverage, and that's when I noticed a pattern that shows up in almost every failing system. Companies keep blaming their people for behaviors that the environment itself is producing. Executive angle 1, shadow it as a design outcome. And this is where it becomes relevant for anyone responsible for systems, because the same pattern I saw in my own work shows up inside companies all the time. People blame users, they blame culture, or they blame a lack of discipline and compliance. But when you look closely, a lot of what gets labeled as bad behavior is not random at all. It's a system outcome. Take shadow IT as a primary example. Most organizations talk about shadow IT like it's a moral failure, where people are intentionally bypassing the official stack. They see employees using unsanctioned apps, exporting data, and building little islands outside the governed environment, and the standard reaction is to tighten control. The result is more policy and more lockdowns. Leadership adds more warnings and central reviews, but here's the thing, shadow IT usually doesn't appear because people woke up and decided governance was annoying. It appears because the official path became too slow, too unclear, or too painful to carry the actual work, and that distinction matters. If the sanctioned environment cannot absorb the speed and practical needs of the people inside it, they will root around it every single time. The reason is simple: work has to continue. When the approved path becomes a bottleneck, bypass behavior becomes the only rational choice for a productive employee. Now map that logic to Microsoft 365. If Teams governance is too confusing, people spin up alternative channels, and if SharePoint structures are too hard to understand, they dump files into whatever folder feels easiest. When Power Platform requests take weeks to process, someone builds a solution in the default environment or outside the tenant entirely just to get the job done. If the official process requires 10 approvals to solve a same-day problem, then the unofficial process becomes the real operating model. That isn't just rebellion, it's structural compensation. The system is doing exactly what it was set up to do, but it just wasn't designed for what the organization actually needs at the edge. This is why I think the phrase shadow IT often hides the real diagnosis by making the problem sound like user disobedience. Structurally, it's usually a usability failure or a governance design failure, because control without usability will always produce bypass behavior. Once you see that, you stop asking how to stop people from using the wrong tools and you start asking better questions. You look for where the friction is too high or where the decision path is too slow, and you find where governance is creating delay without creating any real clarity. That's the business conversation most companies still avoid because it's easier to demand compliance than to redesign the environment. I've seen this pattern so many times where a platform gets rolled out and leadership expects adoption to follow, but the real working conditions never change. There is no simplification, no better information architecture, and no clear ownership of the new tools. Without usable pathways for common needs, people are forced to improvise, and then that improvisation gets labeled as a security risk. And yes, it is a risk, but it's usually a downstream risk caused by an upstream problem. The system made unofficial behavior more functional than the official behavior, and from an executive perspective, that changes what you do next. If Shadow AT is a design outcome, then the solution is structural redesign rather than just enforcement. You reduce bypass behavior by making the governed path more usable and more proportional to the actual speed of the work. And that means fewer dead ends, clearer ownership, and faster workflows. You need better defaults and smarter templates to remove the ambiguity around where work should live and how decisions should move. This is also why technology projects fail when they get framed too narrowly. The tool is not the environment. The environment includes permissions, process design, and the emotional cost of asking for help. If those layers are weak, people don't experience the platform as a helpful operating system, but rather as constant friction. Friction always creates workarounds. So Shadow IT is rarely the first failure in the chain. It's just the visible symptom of an official system that was too hard to use at the speed reality demanded. Executive angle 2, flow of decisions beats tool count. And this is the next mistake companies make when they confuse having more tools with having more speed. Speed is not created by tool count, it is created by decision flow. That's the part a lot of digital transformation work still gets wrong today. A company adds another app or another automation layer, and leadership assumes progress is happening because the stack is getting richer. But if decisions still stall and handoffs remain unclear, then nothing fundamental has actually improved. The interface changed, but the delay did not. Tools do not create operational speed. Clarity and role definition do. Most organizational drag isn't caused by a lack of software, but by the ambiguity of who decides and who owns the next step. If you don't know what information is needed before a step can happen, the tool just becomes a prettier waiting room. Now map that to Power Platform for a second, because people often talk about it like it's magic speed. They build a flow or an app and assume the problem is solved, but those things only help if the underlying decision path is already coherent. If the business logic is messy and responsibilities are vague, then all you really do is scale confusion faster. That isn't transformation, it's just structured chaos. I've seen teams say they need automation when what they really need is a better map of how work actually moves through the office. They need to know who actually talks to whom and where requests actually pause for days at a time. You have to find which approvals are real and which ones are just legacy theater. You have to see where data gets retyped because trust is low, or where people ask for help in teams because the official form is too slow. That is the work that matters first, because once you make the flow of decisions visible, then automation starts making sense. Then Power Automate becomes an orchestration layer rather than a disguise for process confusion. From a system perspective, a lot of companies are not under-tooled, they are under-clarified. They already have enough software to move faster, but they lack a clean decision architecture to support it. Without that architecture, every additional tool just creates another surface where confusion can hide behind more notifications and more dashboards. If you want speed, do not start by asking what tool is missing, but start by asking where the decision path is breaking. Find where ownership becomes fuzzy or where approvals sit without a real decision standard. Bad communication doesn't stay small. It scales the same way a bad data model or weak governance scales. Once confusion enters a repeated workflow, it multiplies every time that workflow runs, and that becomes incredibly expensive. It costs you time, but it also costs you trust. People stop believing the system will help them, so they create manual workarounds just to keep things moving. Once that happens, your organization is no longer running on the platform, but on compensations around the platform. That is a fragile way to do business. Automation and integration matter, but only after you have decision clarity. Speed is not a licensing outcome, it's a systems property. And nowhere is that misunderstanding louder right now than in the world of AI. Executive Angle 3, the Copilot Value Gap. This brings us directly to AI, and specifically to Microsoft Copilot, because this is where the same fundamental misunderstanding gets wrapped in much better marketing. Right now, a lot of companies are investing in AI as if the value sits entirely inside the license itself, which is a bit like buying a high-performance engine and expecting it to win a race while it's still sitting in the crate. They buy the seats, turn the service on, run a few basic training sessions to show people where the buttons are, and then they collect some excited first impressions from the early adopters. After that, leadership expects productivity to spike simply because a digital assistant is now present in the sidebar. But here is what actually happens once the novelty wears off. The workflows stay messy, ownership of tasks remains unclear, and information stays scattered across a dozen different platforms that don't talk to each other. When decision standards stay vague and the underlying process is broken, leaders are inevitably surprised when the actual return on that investment feels thin. That is the Copilot value gap, where the tool enters the organization, but the operating model doesn't change to accommodate it, because the AI is being added to a weak context. That weak context produces weak business value every single time. This matters because AI does not remove the need for structure. In reality, it actually increases it. The better your surrounding environment is, the more useful Copilot becomes. But the worse that environment is, the more expensive your disappointment will be. If your documents are scattered, your permissions are a mess, and your meeting culture is chaotic, AI will not fix the system. It will simply interact with your existing confusion much faster than a human could. That isn't a failure of the AI model itself, but rather a predictable system outcome. And why is that? Because Copilot isn't some magic layer floating above your business reality. It is grounded directly in it. It works with the data, the permissions, the habits, and the process logic that already exist inside your digital environment. If that environment is fragmented, the outputs you get will reflect that fragmentation. And if your source material is noisy, the answers the AI gives you will carry that same noise. When responsibility is vague, a generated next step might still land in a process that has no structural way to handle it. This is exactly why so many AI rollouts feel incredibly impressive during a controlled demo, but end up feeling underwhelming in daily operations. A demo isolates a single task to show you what's possible, but real work includes interruptions, office politics, outdated files, and all the invisible friction that sits between having information and taking action. If none of those structural issues get redesigned, Copilot just becomes another layer of assistance inside a low-clarity system. It might be helpful in small moments, but it rarely becomes transformational. Now, let's map that reality to your ROI. A lot of organizations are still asking the wrong question when they focus on what Copilot can do, which is really just a feature question. The more important thing to ask is what kind of work environment lets Copilot create durable value, because that is an operating question. The answer usually involves the very things companies tend to postpone, like better information architecture, cleaner permissions, and more explicit accountability. Without those foundations, AI adoption easily turns into a form of corporate theater. People use the tool and they might even like parts of it, while leaders mention it in strategy decks to look forward-thinking, but the core system underneath remains untouched. Technology amplifies the quality of your context, but it never replaces the need for operating clarity. If your context is strong, AI helps you scale judgment and coordination, but if it's weak, you're just scaling motion without solving the problem. When I look at Copilot, I don't see a disappointing tool. I see a revealing one that shows whether an organization has done the hard design work first. The freelancer irony and the stealth project. This is where the story gets a little uncomfortable in a way I actually appreciate. Surviving as a freelancer is entirely possible. I'm doing it right now, so I'm not suggesting the model is broken in a simple way. People build real businesses, create personal freedom, and develop massive leverage outside of traditional employment every day. But here's the thing, I've never fully identified with the freelancer label, not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it doesn't accurately describe how I think about work. Freelancing is often framed as independent execution, where a person sells their time or a specific skill, but my instinct has always leaned closer to architecture. I find myself constantly asking how things connect, where capability compounds, and what moves an activity away from a one-off task and into permanent infrastructure. That difference is vital because a lot of freelance work operates inside a very fragile design. When you have one person, one calendar, and one delivery engine, you have created a system with a dangerous single point of failure. Even if the money is great, and the freedom feels real. Putting that much load on one person creates a structure that doesn't scale. Your identity gets wrapped up in being constantly available, which is a system's observation rather than a personal criticism. This is exactly why my current project is so interesting to me, even though I'm helping build an AI platform for freelancers. There is a real irony in building for a category where I don't naturally feel at home, but that distance might be exactly why I can see the structural problem so clearly. Sometimes being an outsider helps you notice the instability that insiders have just learned to normalize. You see the friction in proposals, the drag of administrative work, and the way too much time is spent proving value instead of building reusable leverage. When AI enters this conversation, it's usually framed as a way to write or research faster, which is useful, but it doesn't change the underlying model. If you add a stronger tool to a weak design, you're just using structural compensation to help a fragile system run at a higher speed. The real question isn't how freelancers can use AI to work more, but what kind of operating model AI makes possible for professionals who want to escape permanent volatility. The goal shouldn't be to turn an exhausted person into a slightly faster exhausted person. We should be looking for ways to reduce the dependence on manual effort through better context reuse and more resilient systems around delivery. That is what makes this project worth the effort, especially as independent work faces increasing pressure from platforms and rising client expectations. If we are going to build a better model, it has to be more than just productivity theater. It has to redesign how capability is packaged and sustained over time. I'm not going too deep into the specifics today because this is still a stealth project, though more details will likely surface around the German M365 Con. Net event soon. I wanted to mention it here because the irony matters, and sometimes the most useful work happens at the edge of your own identity. Distance gives you the perspective to see when a market is solving the wrong problem, and right now the design beneath the label is what needs our attention. What 500 episodes actually proved. So after all of that, what did 500 episodes actually prove? To start with, they proved that my original plan was a total failure because the podcast as a job hunting machine simply didn't work. That is just the reality of the situation. I found out the hard way that consistency by itself does not create interviews at the rate I expected, nor does it create a clean conversion from public effort into professional security. I think it is important to say that out loud because so many people stay trapped in activity long after the expected outcome has stopped appearing. They keep feeding a system that is no longer proving itself, and for a long time, I was doing the exact same thing. But here is the more important part of the story. While the failure was real, it wasn't total because the podcast succeeded at producing several outcomes I didn't even know how to value when I started. It brought me into contact with incredible people and expanded my world far beyond the narrow frame of technical explanations. My thinking sharpened until I could translate technology into business consequences much more clearly, and that alone made the effort worth it. The show created entry points into live streams, newsletters, and collaborations that became far more valuable than the audio archive could ever be on its own. The right conclusion here isn't that consistency is useless, but rather that consistency is insufficient for the goals most of us have. Consistency fills the pipe and creates repetition, which builds the endurance you need to survive the early days of any project. It gives you enough surface area for feedback and serendipity to happen, but if you build that repetition without distribution, the value never travels far enough to matter. If you build it without positioning, people won't know what box to put you in, and without execution, the market has no proof that you can actually carry weight. What 500 episodes really showed me is that the winning stack was never just about showing up every day. It was consistency plus distribution, consistency plus positioning, and consistency plus real-world execution and relationships. That is the fundamental difference between just producing output and building actual infrastructure. Once you see that distinction, a lot of modern business activity starts looking like output theater, where teams produce dashboards and AI demos that offer plenty of motion but very little leverage. The reason this milestone matters to me is that it gave me a way to see my own work with much more honesty. The podcast failed to get me a job, but it worked as a tool to meet great people and grow beyond the feature layer of technology. It worked as a way to become a better thinker and helped me create a more resilient business infrastructure, which is the biggest shift of all. If you had asked me early on what I was building, I probably would have said a portfolio, but now I realize I was building a platform for thought and trust to accumulate across different formats. That is a much stronger asset because it is structurally less fragile than a simple collection of past work. A portfolio depends entirely on someone else evaluating your past, whereas infrastructure keeps creating new options for your future. This is why I am less interested now in talking about the grind or heroic consistency, because those stories are too shallow and make it sound like effort is the only hidden key. Effort and discipline matter, but if that effort is pointed into a weak structure, all you get is a very well-maintained version of disappointment. Once you stop romanticizing the idea of just showing up, you can finally start asking better design questions about your career and your systems. You start asking where the distribution is, how you are positioned, and where the execution proof lives within your workflow. You look for the people inside the system who make it more resilient than your own individual output could ever be. Those are the questions that actually change outcomes, and they are far more useful than just counting how many days in a row you've worked. So no, 500 episodes did not prove that consistency wins, but they proved something much better. They proved that repeated action becomes valuable only when it is embedded in the right structure. This means you don't necessarily need to do less work, but you do need to stop asking the work to do jobs it was never structurally set up to do in the first place. If I leave you with one thing today, it is this. Consistency is overrated when it becomes a substitute for distribution, positioning, and trusted relationships. If this episode helped you audit your own work more honestly, I'd love for you to leave a review, connect with me on LinkedIn, and tell me what topic we should break down next. If you are building something right now, please start, but start with the right question. Don't just ask what outcome you want, ask what kind of person and what kind of system this process is actually producing.